Start. Really welcome to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm quite sad because this is the last event of our online book club series. We shall all be feminist, and it was a really nice adventure with my colleague Rebecca so far. And thank you, Rebecca. I'm Martina, I'm a PhD student in political sciences, and I'm one of the facilitators of this event. And Rebecca is my colleague from Civil Society Consulting, a nonprofit consultancy with a mission to strengthen civil society. You can find more information about our past events, and we have also a dedicated page on our website. And these events are delivered by ENORB. You can see the title under my face, which is a network aimed to strengthening mutual understanding and collaboration between religious and non-religious groups. And this project is funded by European Network Against Racism, Empowerment and Resilience Fund. The idea behind this project that's is going to finish today, unfortunately, is to invite different feminist authors and scholars to discuss their work, and not only gain a deeper understanding of critical gender issues that are pervading Europe and beyond today, but share also with the wider audience. Let me introduce our second facilitator today, Rebecca, a master student in gender studies, who is going to introduce our brilliant speaker today.
Thank you, Martina. So I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Alex Iantaffi, who is the co-author of How to Understand Your Gender and Life Isn't Binary. So as they say, as a recovering academic, they've researched and published extensively on gender, disability, sexuality and relationship issues. Alex also works as a therapist, supervisor at their own clinical practice, Edges Wellness Centre, LLC, and is the host of the podcast series Gender Stories, which I do urge you all to take a look at as well. So the focus of this event is on Alex's co-authored book, Life Isn't Binary. So it combines the experience as academics, activists and practicing therapists, Barker and Iantaffi illuminating how everyone can benefit from unpacking the binaries that have taken residence within them. So packed with exercises, reflections and writing prompts and therapeutic guides, Life Isn't Binary proposes topics such as sexuality, race, disability, and says these are not debates but experiences that afford us the opportunity to reconsider and reconfigure our relationship to the world. So beginning where their first book left off, Barker and Iantaffi gather examples ranging from Brokeback Mountain to Disney's Pixar's Inside Out to examine assumptions and underscore contemporary discussions about sexuality, gender, relationships, bodies, emotions, and ultimately thinking itself. So just quickly, so the boring bits, just in terms of today's structure, Martina and I are going to be discussion with Alex for about 45 minutes or so, and then for the few of us that are here, we just love to open the floor if anyone has any burning questions. If you have any along the way, just throw them in the chat, so we'll be sure to get them at the end. And just for information, we've just turned everyone's speakers off, so we don't get any background noise. And finally, for acknowledgement, we are recording this event as well. And so, great to get into the discussion. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Alex.
Hello. I'm good. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here for this event. What an honor to close such a brilliant series. I hope to live up to all the other wonderful discussions that I know you've had. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you for being here today. I just like to start with a question, of course. So your book was amazing, and I really appreciate your book, your co-authored book. And we know that you're a therapist and also an academic, and we'd like to know what initially motivated to write this book, because I think that this could be something in your work as a therapist, maybe, so you know a lot of experience, but you know, that's our first question to you.
That's a great question. Well, I've always, I've had 20 years in academia before transitioning to focusing more on my clinical career. And I always had a passion for taking both kind of concepts, but also lived experience and presenting them in a more accessible way. And so I think that definitely once I left full-time academia in 2015. That was the impetus for a lot of creativity. You know, I have 5 books out and just finished writing the 6th book that's going to come out next year. So I think that first of all, not being within the confines of academia really freed up my thinking and creativity, because I didn't have to kind of walk this narrow confines of only this type of writing counts, right? Only this type of publication counts. And so I think for me, I know that's beyond just the individual book, but one thing that's really important to myself and to MJ as well, I know, is to really challenge that divide between kind of academic knowledge and just knowledge in general, right? And so and one of the other binaries that I like to challenge is this division of also the lived experience and scholarship, right? Scholarship actually extracts a lot of knowledge from lived experience, but then packages it in this very colonial way of almost owning the knowledge they've extracted often from minoritized communities, especially on certain topics, right? And so what is it like to actually challenge that experience and have both scholarship and lived experience combined in a book, right? So that's definitely one thread that's across pretty much all of my books, some more than others, right? Gender trauma is more for professionals, so there's there's some lived experiences, but not as much as in like Life Isn't Binary or the other books. And I think for Life Isn't Binary specifically, both MJ and I have a lot of kind of liminal experiences around identities, but in different ways. So for example, you know, we are trans, but in different ways, right? Even though we have the same assigned gender at birth, our gender expression is pretty different from each other, but it's still in that liminal space of not falling neatly into a binary. My racialized experience has been really different depending on where I've lived in the globe across three different countries, right? My kind of like religious experience has been being brought up, for example, within Catholicism, and then kind of by a very pagan type of Catholicism in Southern Europe, and then really realizing how that was even at odds with the same religion when it translated to Northern Europe, for example. And so for me, my whole life, I've been really fascinated by how we're often kind of encouraged or pushed, we could even say, into this or that, right? Binary, who are you? What are, you know, where do you stand on an issue? But often life is actually much more nuanced and complex than that. And definitely as a therapist, I have definitely seen that at play with my clients too, that if we get stuck into that binary all or nothing thinking, or very kind of dichotomous thinking of this is either this or that, and there's nothing possible in between, this kind of polarized position, it can be very painful and hurtful, and also not very relational. You know, and I have a deep belief that kind of oppositional binary thinking is actually a manifestation of trauma, not just on an individual level, but also on an historical level, right? Like when we look at colonialism, all different types of colonialism, you know, there is a destruction of relationship. You know, disruption of relationship with place, disruption of even relationship between people. There needs to be a certain level of dehumanizing for colonialism to work, right? And so that encourages a split, a dualistic type of thinking that I think then it's pervasive in lots of different ways. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your maybe way, like you maybe wanted a much more straightforward answer, but that's a meandering one.
But I mean, we really appreciate what you have to say. So really thank you. And I've seen that much in your book. I mean, also the experiences, not only like what the academia is saying, and also like feminist author. You mentioned Butler, Foucault,
Yes.
of course, and they're really accessible also, I'd say. Not just put because it's like an academic paper, and it's difficult to understand, but they're really accessible. And at the same time, at the end of the chapter, you have like lived experience, and I felt like this is a really feminist and decolonial approach to you know, to present something when you have something to say from an also academic perspective. And I was thinking about that and your experience particularly. So what you have said, it's quite, intimate. And also in your book, you write about your experience a lot. You and MJ, you're writing a lot about your experience. Also, another thing that's quite, feminist, to start first with yourself and to position yourself. But I was wondering, I really appreciate that, but I was wondering if it came naturally to you. It was, was that difficult, or was it natural? You came with that idea.
Yeah, I think you'll be unsurprised to hear that's a both and from somebody who's clauded life as a binary. It was both natural and difficult at the same time. I think I've always kind of, I think I've always naturally, whatever nature means, like, or instinctually, like, not ever been very comfortable with any rigid binaries, including this very stark kind of differentiation between, almost like object of research and the subject of the researcher in academia. And so I always really felt that I wanted to position myself. I remember even writing my PhD back in the 90s, so a little while ago, that ages me, but back in the mid 90s, really thinking, from this while still being fairly steeped in second wave feminism, I would say, in the early 90s, really wanting to take that personalist political seriously, and really feeling that division of the researcher talking, as a disembodied being, there was already a lot of scholarship about that. And so that, I would say that my scholarship was very much rooted in challenging that academic kind of tension between subject and object of research. And so in a way, it was intentional in that it is part of my feminism. And so in another way, it's difficult because you're putting yourself out there. When you put yourself out there, it's really not seen as objective, right? And therefore scholarly. A number of times when I was in academia, I've had colleagues say, well, aren't you biased, for example, about trans healthcare if you're trans, right? And I said, yes, but wouldn't you also biased if you're cis and either researching cis people or trans people? We're all biased, right? This idea, this very feminist idea that really challenging objectivity, which can ever exist really, especially in kind of more qualitative sociological, psychological research. And so in that way, I think it was challenging because it's often not seen as valid scholarship when you weave your experiences in. And it's also very vulnerable. It also means that you're putting some of your stuff out there, even though everything I put in books has been very much processed, right? There's nothing that's like so raw that I would put out there for public consumption. I think Brené Brown actually talks about that in, I can't remember if it's in one of her books or she talked about it in a talk, like we can put out vulnerable stuff that we've already processed out there. So it's not that it's not vulnerable, but there is some level of groundedness that comes with it, right? So it's a grounded vulnerability. And so that is, that's an ongoing exercise, I would say, to kind of practice the grounded vulnerability, right? I've processed this enough that I can talk about it in a way that is not so kind of raw and tender, because there is, it does create also a feeling of people like knowing you or knowing who you are, which that engenders parasocial relationships, which are also interesting to navigate as an author and as a scholar, right? Because there are only pieces of me out there, not a whole of me, right? There might be lots of pieces if people have read all of my work, but they're still just pieces, not a whole person, And so I would say, yes, it's both kind of difficult in terms of challenging certain paradigms and also natural, because I don't know how else I would want to write, right? Whenever I've had to write in this very like peer-reviewed way, very disembodied way, that has always felt uncomfortable and disingenuous also to me, right? You're taking yourself out, but you're still there. Whereas like we are there, so let's just say who we are and where we are, if that makes sense.
No, that does make sense. And I was just thinking about my own academic writing at the moment, but it's that objectiveness that you can't be biased, you can't do this. But sometimes you think, what's the point of writing? What kind of motivates you to write? No, exactly. Yeah. So maybe just to bring it back a little bit, because you went through so much in your first question, which is fantastic. I'd love to just unpick that a little bit. So maybe starting with the title of the book. And for those who haven't read it, you do go into quite detail about what it means. But just for us now, so both beyond and in between, maybe what was the reasons behind this? Why it's such an important way of thinking? In your own words, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think the title, titles are always so complicated. I'm a very like, I'm a very kind of concrete titles person. And so I don't often come up with like very smart titles. And I think Life Isn't Binary was just, to me, was like at MJ, it's very concrete, it's facts, right? It's like life isn't like binary. All of us have such complex relationship. I would dare anybody to draw that clear line. Please tell me exactly where like transgender folks stop, non-binary people stop, cis people begin, right? Where do we draw the line between like even with bodies? Where do you draw the line between fat and thin? Where do you draw the line between black and brown and other shades and like colorism, right? It's like, it's just, where do you draw the line even in thinking into kind of what is absolutely right and what is absolutely wrong, right? Which is a question that ethics have, the whole field of ethics is based on this idea of like, how can we know what is absolutely right and what is absolutely wrong, right? And the reality is that we can't, because life is complicated, contextual, relational. And so the Life Isn't Binary piece feels very like concrete. And I would say that being both beyond and in between is also very concrete. When we're not in a binary, sometimes it's both and. I remember a kid at my daughter's school going, "Are you a boy or a girl? Oh, are you a boy?" And I was like, "No." "Are you a girl?" "No." And then they were like, "Well, you gotta be one." And I was like, "Well, I'm kind of a little bit of both." Right. And so for me, like, there isn't an experience in terms of gender of being both, in terms of virtualization of both being white but non-Anglo white, living in Anglo countries. So, what is it like to be both of something that is supposed to be either or? Also, what is supposed to be outside of categories? There are also people who are agender. There are also people, kind of and also acknowledging the fact that some of those binaries haven't always existed. They are a product of colonialism, right? And also a desire, what does lie beyond the binary thinking. So that's the beyond piece. But there's also an in-between piece, right? Where, for example, in a lot of ways, sometimes it's clear I can be both of a thing or I can be beyond something. But what happens when you fall between the cracks? For example, in terms of my disability, it was much more invisible when I wrote this book, and now it's much more visible, right? So I'm often kind of in between categories also, right? I didn't need to I didn't used to need many accommodations, and now I need more accommodations. My brain still works, but my executive dysfunction is higher as I get older for lots of reasons. And so there's also that place where you can feel that you're falling between the cracks, and I've heard also some of my friends and clients of mixed heritage, for example, that they can feel in between, right? And kind of almost pull one direction or another. And so again, I think that being both beyond and between was very concrete. Like, if life isn't binary, you might have all of these experiences of feeling you're both something that you're not supposed to be both of being in between two categories where you don't fit neatly into either, but also to either want to or be beyond some of those categories that people want to impose on us. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense to me. And sometimes we ask like this kind of seem really easy question, but because like for those that studies gender studies, this is quite like perfect sense. But like the aim of the event and the aim of the book club is to make accessible to everyone. So sometimes like our question seems like really easy, and then it's because of that, but it really makes perfect sense to me. And I'd like to stay in this topic a little bit. In the chapter about sexuality, you mentioned that you mentioned this, you try to go beyond the binary as well, as you do in the whole book, and you do with MJ also about sexualities. And at a certain point you say that also the spectrum seems not it seems not enough sometimes. So I'd like to ask you this, for those that haven't read your book and are not so comfortable with this, why sometimes the spectrum is not enough, and what your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the spectrums can be really beautiful to explain that something can be a broad range, right? But when it comes to sexuality, I mean, when it comes to almost everything, that's why also around gender, a lot of people now are talking about gender is like a galaxy, or, I often talk about gender as a landscape, right? And I think similarly with sexuality, if you have a spectrum, I'm really appreciative of a lot of people like Kinsey and Klein really challenge that dichotomy, right? Of you're gay or straight, for example, right? Homosexual versus heterosexual, and as a bi queer person, I really appreciate that challenge. But also it's so complicated, right? Because when it comes to sexuality, not only, first of all, again, where, is it always a neat spectrum? So even if I take my own sexuality, there are so many different axes and points to consider. There is identity, which is like who we are, right? But then there's like attraction, who we are attracted to, and that can also be dependent on so many variables, right? There's kind of behavior, what we actually do with all of that. There is past behavior, current behavior, future behavior. There's also fantasy and desire, right? And so when I say that the spectrum is, and also even kind of, if we go from gay to straight and all this different sexuality, where would you then even put asexuality or aromanticism, right? Even the spectrum is still a fairly allosexual spectrum if we don't break it down more. And then even asexuality or aromanticism are their own landscapes in their own right. And then there is also the added complication that humans often don't come into a neat package where identity, desire, attraction, behavior all stack neatly, right? Sometimes it's real messy, and I think that as a bi, queer, trans, non-binary person, I see a lot of the messiness sometimes, not just on an intellectual level, but on a really practical level. For example, I had some gold star gays hit on me. They're like the gays who've never interacted with a vagina. For those of you who don't know what a gold star gay is, but for those of us who are oldies, like gold star gays we're still a thing. They're still a thing, I hear, for some people, and I've had sometimes gold star gays hitting on me as a trans, mass, non-binary person, but then I'm like, I don't know what to do with you. And I was like, what do you mean you don't know what to do with me? Have you never interacted just like with the body, with an asshole, which by the way, everybody has. I hope we can get like really practical on some things, and they're like, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. And then I'm like, why are you even interacting with me then? And like, well, but you're handsome. And I'm like, okay, you are just like confused, right? And not in a bad way, but just in a, oh, this is my identity, and I've been told I have to hold on to my identity in certain ways. But now I'm experiencing an attraction that I have zero framework for, right? And similarly, there could be so many examples when it comes to sexuality, right? And also it's like, where do you put kind of kink, you know, on that? Some of us are more kinky, some of us are less kinky. We're kinky in different ways. And then when it's a spectrum, there's just not enough points, right, for all those variables. I think it's like all of those things interact to make up our sexuality, right? The sense of who we are, who we're attracted to, what do we want to do, how that changes over time even, you know, and then where do you put that kind of allosexual versus more asexual end of the spectrum, or more kinky versus less kinky. And so I think when I say the spectrum is not quite enough, that's what we mean, is that the spectrum is still more limited for the reality of sexuality, which is very expansive. And we haven't even talked about sexuality as including just our sense of being able to access pleasure and a sense of being alive, which even goes beyond sex, right? It's like, and then when you put ecosexuality on the map, it's like, you can't even map it on like a gay or straight spectrum, right? So it goes on and on. Yeah. I will stop saying, if that makes sense. That's something I'm trying to stop saying as much of. It's a bad habit from being forced into female socialization for so long.
Exactly. And you have to read everyone to read your chapter, because you just give so many different examples that make you stop and think, oh God, I've never thought about the way, but it's kind of obvious, but it's not as well, which is fantastic. I really loved your section of kind of explaining the differences, similarities, and how they intertwine between identity, behaviour, and attraction. But I feel like now, and a lot of people I know, my own circles, find it really like difficult to accept that these are fixed, how they can change over time. I was just wondering, from your research experience, perhaps, why we find this so difficult to expect that things can change.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, you know, as humans, and some of us, you know, and somebody who's also discovered or made sense of my neurodivergence in the last couple of years, I fully understand our desires for wanting things to stay the same, right? Things staying the same is comfortable. Like, if I know how this candy tastes and it tastes the same every time, I'm not going to have a sensorial surprise when I put this candy in my mouth, right? Like, we do have a deep desire. You know, if I know my parents are going to like love me unconditionally, always in the same way and in the perfect way, right? Then I don't have, that is comfortable, you know, which very few, if any of us, ever get. And so I think we have a deep desire for control, because control soothes our anxiety. And things changing are often beyond our control, right? And things that are beyond our control increase our anxiety by and large. You know, that's why there is a whole beautiful field of Buddhism in Eastern thinking that encourages kind of non-dualistic thinking as a practice, right? And radical acceptance as a practice, because change and uncertainty can make us really anxious. And I think we live in a Western dominant culture where we are taught to think that everything is under our control, but it's actually not. So we're constantly, it's almost we're gaslit on a cultural or social level to think that things should be under our control, right? There's a lot of legacy also of kind of Protestant ethics, right? If you work in a certain way, and if you do things in a certain way, then you'll be rewarded in a certain way, right? In terms of Christianity. So, or even in terms of mind over matter, right? All of those expressions reinforce this idea that somehow we have dominion and control over things that are beyond our control, which I think has deep roots in Christian supremacy, actually, and colonialism. Again, I think a lot of things have roots in colonialism, in case you haven't noticed. But this deep desire for control also has deep roots in colonialism. And we are brought up with it, right? We want certainty, we want fixedness, but the reality is life is not certain, it's not fixed. The more we're taught that it should be fixed, the more we struggle, right, against it, if that makes sense. Yeah.
It seems that there's a lot to unpack here. Like, everything, basically, everything is rooted in our colonialist mindset, and a lot of things are rooted in that. And speaking about that, actually, also we kind of try to have control also over time. So we just,
Yes.
you know where I'm going, right? Yeah, we kind of want to have control. So we have like our system of organized time. You have month, days, hours, everything is so organized. And also like time of the lives. So we have like the birth and the adolescence and everything that's on. And my question is, in your book, you mentioned something that's kind of different from this perspective, and that's the trans time. So would you like to explain us a little bit about trans time?
Absolutely. Oh, there's so much to say about time generally. But focusing on trans time specifically, I think there are people who have probably talked about and written about this much better than I have. But my understanding of trans time is that, you know, a lot of us who are trans, once we come into a fuller understanding of who we are, or we're able to kind of articulate who we are as trans people, in a way kind of have to revisit developmental milestones in a lot of ways, right? So you know, if you are assigned female at birth and you're kind of forced into female socialization and kind of milestone, you might have missed a lot on, you know, how do you dress in a more masculine way? You know, we all explore how to present ourselves in our teenage years, you know, how do I want to do my hair, you know, and similarly, you know, if you're more on the trans feminine spectrum, similarly in terms of exploring femininity after that enforced kind of masculinity. And so trans time is really a time where a lot of us kind of revisit developmental milestones in a lot of ways around exploring our identity, exploring who we are, how do we relate to others from this different location within ourselves in some ways. And I think it can be more intense for some people than others. Also, for those of us who choose to do body modification through hormones, that can also be hormonal shifts that are generally experienced like in adolescence that you might be experiencing in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 70s, you know, and that's the thing. And so in a way, as trans folks, we also challenge this idea of time and when certain developmental changes can happen, right? Like, for example, breast development happens at a certain point in time for cis people, but for a trans feminine person who takes estrogen, it might happen in their 40s, which is not a time where we would expect that type of development, and right? And so in a way, trans time also really challenges the idea that things can only happen at a certain time, right? That our bodies can go through certain changes only at a certain time, that we can explore our identities only at a certain time, right? Often there is an expectation of time being linear. When you explore who you are in your teenage years, then you know who you are, then you're an adult, right? And there are certain ways in which you behave. You cannot be potentially playful or so on, or this is the time in your life to have relationship. This is the time on your life to have children. This is the time in your life to have a career, right? And often when you're trans, you challenge that in so many ways, from when body modifications happen to how you explore your identity, to how you do your relationships as well, because that's going to change, right? And so, and of course, even, you know, for example, if we take hormones and we go through what sometimes people call a second adolescence, what does that even mean if I'm going through my second adolescence in the body of a 40-year-old, right? When I took testosterone for a short time, I was in my early 40s, you know, a decade ago. I'm not like 15, right? I have different mechanisms for self-soothing, emotion management, right? So even though I'm riding similar hormonal waves, I have additional tools. I also have a fully developed brain that a 15-year-old doesn't, you know. And so sometimes I also challenge some of the narratives that people have around trans time. And that can be interesting as well, right? Because like if we have a narrative, oh, now hormones are like, my body's out of control. I'm like, but your body's not going to be out of control in the same way as if you were 15 when you're 40, because like your brain has gone through different development, right? So trans time, I think, challenges a lot of that, of our idea of time as linear, I think, and also expands what is possible. I don't think just for trans people, I think for everybody. It's like you don't have to be trans to challenge ideas of linear time. But I think that, and I think the ideas of linear time do need to be challenged for our well-being.
I love that. It's something we rely on, but we think is so fixed, troubling that and questioning that. And then you just think the possibilities you say that come out of thinking this way, even now, is just fantastic. It kind of makes me happier because I kind of, even myself, when I think it's the age needs to do something, 20s, everything's all up in the air. And it just kind of makes you breathe a little bit, because you put so many prompts in your books that make you sit and breathe and go, oh, I can't have control over this. It doesn't have to be that certain way. And I think that's really wonderful. Yeah, and that's what I enjoy so much.
That's definitely the intention, to feel more expansive and not so constricted, right? Because when we feel constricted, there's less sense of possibility, right? But when we can expand, there is more possibility, more relationality. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. So kind of a little bit related, but kind of moving off a little bit. You talk a lot about kind of the power of representation, and you describe how visibilization kind of has a lot of negative effects. And as humans, we need to be represented, or we need to be mirrored, or in that kind of sense. So given how powerfully cultural norms are embedded in society, do you think we'll ever come to a place where we're all represented, all on equal terms, and all accepted? Let's say that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to predict the future, right? I remember once writing this chapter on the future of non-binary genders, and I was like, well, let's look at science fiction, even though it's a psychology book, because that's really when we're exploring the future is speculative, right? It really is science fiction. We're trying to imagine this future. I don't know about whether it also has to be all equal at all times, right? I think with representation, it's just like, who gets to be, visible in a lot of ways. And it doesn't also, it can be in really big ways, like popular culture, movies, songs, and media, but also just who gets to be visible and take up space, right, in society. And I think that when we don't see ourselves in whatever way, whether it's in a book or in a TV series or something else, it's hard to imagine who we can be, right? I remember I had never seen a trans masculine person. And so it wasn't, even though, when I was young, I really enjoyed presenting in a certain way. I would really enjoy if people thought I was a boy rather than a girl. I didn't have language for it. I didn't have a framework. And so whereas young people today have language and have framework, you can have 10 years old who are like, I am 8th grade bisexual, something, and I'm like, you are amazing. Like, who you are because you have all this language, right? And so whether it's language, whether it's seeing ourselves through people on the internet or the movie or a song, I don't know if it's possible for all of us to be represented in equal ways, but I think it's possible to have more of humanity represented. I think I've seen already a huge shift from my childhood compared to my kids' childhood, for example. The kind of movies that even Disney and Pixar, with all of their problems, right? The very problematic mainstream kind of enterprises. But, comparing, I don't know, Snow White to Brave or Frozen or, all these movies about intergenerational trauma and Canto. I mean, I feel like Pixar only does intergenerational trauma, right? But it's like they're just the level of representation, and my daughter is almost 20 now, I think it was the last couple of years I can't remember what it was, but the last couple of years, once she was like, yeah, if it's not queer, I don't want to watch it on Netflix. And I was like, of course, because you have options. I remember staying up until like late at night when I was living in the UK, waiting for like Dyke TV or something to come on so that I could watch the one really bad lesbian movie, that I couldn't just stream on TV because there was no streaming, right? And for Gen Z, I mean, I love it. They're like, yeah, if it's not queer, I don't want to see it. And I'm like, of course, because you have 150 different choices of how to be queer, on TV. And that's amazing. Adon, I'm so excited about that, right? So I think it's definitely change is possible because I've seen it in my lifetime. Change is not perfect. We still have such a long way to go. Most non-binary representation is white non-binary representation, for example. We still have so many intersections that are missing. But I think that change is possible and is happening. Change is just also slow and painful. And so sometimes it's really a both end, right? Sometimes I really feel the push of people younger than me. They're like, this is not good enough. I want more. And I'm like, yes, I feel that energy. And also this is also amazing because this would not have happened 20 years ago. And so really feeling that both end and in between, right? Going back to that title of kind of feeling in between, that ongoing always desire and push to do more and better, and also the taking a pause to really love how far we've come in terms of representation, while also holding the tension of how far we still have to go. If that, yeah.
I think you just answered my, I'd say, huge question about those new way of representation. That I mean, I've seen this huge change and representation as well. And I think that it happened like in 10 years, let's say, really fast, really quick. And I can see also like some really critic points in that as well. And I just always don't know if that's good, if that's bad, but it's my binary thinking about that. I mean, it shouldn't be like that. And so maybe it's much more complex than this. I mean, there's the good and there's the bad in that. And I think that in this time we just and it's really, I'd say, in Italy especially, in this dark period, just take what's good about new representations, and let's see what happened. I have a really last question, and then I saw that's another question in the chat, but I'm really interested in this. We mentioned colonialism a lot today, and also in your book. And in your book, you mentioned the handmaid's tale, and you mentioned that this happened actually, like the development of sexual rights of white women was indeed, carried out on Black and racialized bodies. And that was really interesting to know. And I'd like to know if there are any examples or, to understand better what you mean by that. And I promise this last question, and then I open the floor to other
That's
questions.
okay. Yeah, and I'm very grateful. Again, I think that Black scholars and activists have talked about this much better than I ever can, and a lot of what I hope that MJ and I, when we write together, and when I write by myself, and really put across that a lot of those ideas are not our new ideas. We're drawing on like a body of scholarship and activism and work, and in a way we're kind of drawing from a lot of collective voices. And so I would say that similarly on this, especially in the US, after the 2016 elections, I think it was when Trump came into power, right? A lot of cis white women, and I think we've seen this recently as well, with in what we currently call the United States, with the push against reproductive rights, right? A lot of cis white women were like, this has never happened in history. Like, this is scary, right? And a lot of Black women were like, what are you all talking about? This is not the worst time in history for women. It definitely is not for Black women, you know. There has been a time. And so I think it's about challenging that a kind of white imperialist colonial perspective that only sees things happening when they're happening to them, if that makes sense, right? And so and Handmaid's Tale was like this, oh yes, and I mean, I'd read a lot of Atwood's work, but when, the Handmaid's Tale was really popular to stream during that time, there were just a lot of cis white women that were like, yes, this is the future. And I was like, and a lot of Black women that were saying, this is not just the future, this is our past and also our present in a lot of ways, right? If we think about the reality of international interracial adoption, for example, right? Or even who does surrogacies in certain ways. I think there is, capitalism, colonialism still play a huge role around reproductive function and who gets to have body sovereignty and who doesn't. Right? Or even when we think about the enforced sterilization of a lot of young disabled women, especially what in the medical taxonomy would be called young women with developmental disabilities, which, and I say in the medical taxonomy because that is really its own framework. And so in a way, it's kind of when we think, this has never happened before. I really want people to encourage to ask themselves, has this never happened to you and people who look like you before? Or has this truly never happened in history? Because most of the time, these things have happened, maybe they haven't happened to you yet. And so, and when we say, when we make those statements like, oh, this is the first time in history this has happened, or this is the future, we are erasing kind of the reality often of Black, Brown, Indigenous body minds and people who have experienced and keep experiencing certain type of control from the state and so on and so forth. I'm aware of time, so I'm like, I'll pause. There's so much to say on this one, but I'll pause.
I can imagine. Well, thank you for contextualising that, Alex. Because we'd love to open it to everyone else. We've got a question in the chat from Maria, who I don't know who wants to say it herself, or I can read it out. I can read it out.
Yeah,
okay.
However you prefer. I'm good with that. Thank you.
Who is bringing it back to our amazing, which we love, topic about time, and kind of reflecting on how little time it seems to combat such of negative binary and otherizing thinkings in a capitalist society or liquid society that's divisive per se. So maybe just your thoughts on that, Alex. Are we running out of time, basically?
Yeah, one to add that I think, sorry, that applies with also what you were mentioning about colonialism and this otherizing in general. Mm-hmm. And whenever we get thrown a comment, like any type of comment against a collective, a group, or a person, there's so little time to enter a conversation, because also most of the times people that are making these comments, they don't really want to engage in a conversation. So if they, and now we have elections here in Spain. I'm from Spain, I'm from Barcelona, and we have elections on Sunday, and there are so many narratives in the media, but from main and big political parties like across Europe. Transphobia, racism is just everywhere. And these type of arguments, of narratives, leave no time to talk or to even combat. And the left is finding themselves, or we're finding ourselves with this so little time to really engage into a conversation. And I was really reflecting on how can we change these narratives. And I like to think about love from a political perspective. So using love in any interaction with someone, that can be a way, but we really left with no time, and I was just very curious to hear and know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's such a great comment, Maria. And yeah, it's so right. Capitalism is, in a way, kind of goes hand in hand with colonialism, right? They really love each other, and capitalism makes us very focused on content, an outcome rather than process. For example, it's not very relational. You know, I remember even kind of moving from more Southern Europe to Northern Europe, like being on time, you know, and even in the US, it's a sign of respect. I'm like, but respect for who? Because it's like if you, you know, relationally, for example, if your kid needs 5 more minutes to get out the door, that to me is more important, right, than being absolute, you know, what's going to happen if I'm 5 minutes late for a meeting? You know, I remember even my oldest being like obsessed with having to be to school on time. And I was like, yes, being on time can be important. And if you have to like upset your whole family to be on time, then it's not, is it worth it relationally, right? And I think that's for me, it's that more collectivist culture versus individualized culture. And capitalism wanted highly rugged individualist culture because you buy more in an individualist culture, right? You're not sharing resources. You're not, you know, relationality in a way is counter to capitalism. And so when it comes to love, I think that love and relationships take time, you know, love even not just in a romantic way, but truly beloved community, right? Like love of human, building beloved community is going to take time. And you can only move at the speed of trust, as a lot of people, including Adrienne Mary Brown, have said, right? It's like relationships take time, they take effort. Often, I think for me, it's the difference between community organizing and activism, for example. Yes, we can mobilize quickly for an issue for activism, but community organizing needs to be the foundation of activism, because if we don't have relationships with one another, we can't trust one another. And so we can only move quickly in certain ways, right? And capitalism is absolutely divisive. I would say that capitalism really wants to break down relationality, wants to break down intergenerational families, intergenerational communities, you know, collective living, sharing of resources, mutual aid. All those things are counter to capitalism. And in a way, the more love, the less capitalism works, right? Because if we have beloved community, we're in relationship, we're not necessarily going to feel this constant sense of lack and failure that capitalism feeds on, right? But if we constantly feel like we don't have enough time and we're not doing enough, then we want to buy more to do more with our time and to do more, right? So in a way, it kind of feeds our productivity to feel kind of a sense of lack. And that the less love, the more lack you're going to feel, you know, the more sense of missing something you're going to feel. And so, yeah, I do think that capitalism is a huge issue when it comes to those topics. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I think that's quite inspiring, and to hear about community organizing and as well like attached and linked to activism, because sometimes we can all feel a bit hopeless and just drawn by all this negativity and hatred. But it's really interesting. Sorry if you cannot really see my face very well.
No, it's all good.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your words.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mariah. It was really interesting. Thank you, Alex. I totally agree. Also, like, I feel like capitalism is kind of a monster that subsume also like narratives from the feminist and the LGBTQI plus community a lot of times, and makes me really angry because the narratives, symbols, and words that the community just thought about, and with like also with their own lives, and capitalism just subsumes everything like kind of a monster. And in the meantime, you don't have time to think about, as Maria said. Well,
I love that. It's that commodification. Yeah.
Yeah, really. Like I don't know if you know the Pokemon Ditto.
Yes.
The Pokemon
I
Ditto.
do know the Pokemon.
Yeah. That like kind of changes every time. Yeah, that kind of capitalism in my mind.
Yeah, you kind of, there's definitely a linear evolution, then you tetralize and whatever. Yes. Yeah.
Are there any other questions from the public? Comments, suggestions? You can raise in the chat, you can hand up.
If there's no more, we got 1 minute left. I was wondering, Alex, if I could ask one last question of you, if that's okay. I thought we just wanted to finish. So now we understand the world is really not best to live through binaries. How would you say, or how can we live through uncertainty and so many paradoxes? In your opinion, what is the best way to live through this?
Oh, I don't know. What is the best? As somebody who's written co-author the Life is a Binary book, I don't know if I can tell you what is the best.
Yeah,
absolute.
But how do you?
Yeah,
question.
That's a better question, I think, for me. Thank you, Rebecca. I think that what I do for myself is like I strive, to practice that every day, right?
Okay.
And to really recognize how that is a struggle for me in a lot of ways, different way in every day. And now it's the practice, Again, I think I'm going to go back to kind of Black activists and scholars have also taught me that hope is a discipline. Hope is not just something that comes because, and actually I'm quite an optimistic person, but I think that even for an optimistic person at the moment, it can be hard when looking at the world at times. And I think that my friend Donald Engstrom Rees would say that despair is a luxury for the bourgeois, right? And so it's like, if hope is a discipline, like what does despair gets me, And so for me, it's like that practice of recognizing all the contradictions within me and all the nuances within me and not trying to cut them up and make them palatable in specific ways, recognizing just how challenging it is to radically accept the other person as other from you, to really and I nurture that in whether it's relationship with myself, with the land, in my parenting, my relationship with my partners, my relationship with community, or communities I'm part of. I think it is like a daily practice. I don't think it's not a one and done, right? It's recognizing when we get caught up in those binaries, is there something else that is possible? Or if I feel like, well, it's either this or that, can I take a breath or 2 or 3? It doesn't take that long to take 3 intentional breaths, but that is the pause that maybe allows me to recognize that I don't need to get caught up in the struggle, that I can find some more spaciousness, or if there isn't more spaciousness, can I find some internal spaciousness in how I relate to this tension, right? And so I would say it's a daily practice, my relationships and in everything I do. And sometimes I'm better at it than others. And sometimes I'm not.
That's great. Thank you for that, Alex.
Thank you for that, Alex. Thank you for everything, for shared with us your experience. I know that's not really easy, as you said before, so I really thank you. And I would say that I would like to go on like hours, because there's so much to unpack here, and it's really good to talk to you. And thank you, Maria, for your intervention. Really appreciated that. Oh, sorry, you were blocked. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. I can hear you.
But the time with you has finished, and so thank you again, also from home. We hope to see you again in the future, and we are waiting for your next book, or whatever whatever you write about or you do. We're just looking forward to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Well, How to Understand Your Relationship is coming out next year. I have no idea how it's going to land. We talk about abolishing the family. It's going to be a whole other thing. But
that's great. I love it. I cannot wait to read it. That'll be fantastic, Alex. The nuclear family.
Thank you so much for your time today and for this really beautiful, sweet, in-depth conversation. I appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Alex. Have a great rest of the afternoon, everybody. Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Everybody. Thank you so much.